It's difficult to come up with a topic over the past 3 years or so that has dominated more of the substantive political conversation than what should be done about the police. I'm sure you can think of slogans that have been thrown around and campaigns that have been based on denouncing those slogans. And it's been several years now since the massive social justice protests of 2020. So why don't we take a look at what's actually being done and what can potentially be done in the future when it comes to police departments all over the country? We're very lucky to be joined today to discuss this topic by the Executive Director for People for the American Way, as well as the former mayor of Ithaca, New York, Svante Myrick. Welcome to the Damage Report.
Thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate it, and it's great to be here.
It's great to have you here. And so, look, we all know that there's been a lot of words thrown around about overarching concepts of what should be done in terms of police reform. But I'm interested, before we dive into some of what can be done, I would love for us to set out like a firm idea of what has actually been done. Because I know, crime is higher than it was a few years ago. And during this midterm, a lot of the Republicans are saying that that's because following the 2020 protests, everyone everywhere defunded the police. But what has actually been going on in communities across America?
Yeah, and see, so this is a really important point, is to acknowledge that crime has risen in the last 2 years, but it's not because the police have been defunded. Because first, the police have not been defunded, and almost no community across the country has police spending decreased. So why did crime go up? It's because the rest of our social fabric frayed. When the schools closed, when community centers closed, when people lost their jobs, when people were afraid, crime went up. That alone should give us the recipe to bringing crime down. It's not just throwing more funding at police necessarily, though it's important to fund a public safety system. The answer is to make investments in that social safety system. So, but what has been happening? Now, here's what's interesting when you have a local controlled problem, right? Police departments are controlled by localities. They're controlled by mayors and city council members. But it is clear that we have a national issue when it comes to policing. In almost every community, there is tension between the marginalized and our public safety employees. So people were looking for a federal solution, and I think this is where they got frustrated. They waited for Congress to do something, and I don't have to tell you or your viewers that waiting for Congress to do something is a recipe for frustration. What has been happening while Congress has failed to act is that a bunch of mayors have gotten on their horse and have actually seen through reforms. In my 10 years as mayor of the city of Ithaca, we reformed the Ithaca Police Department in 3 big times. The third one is still underway, a big reformation that will include unarmed officers working arm in arm with armed officers. That same concept is in use right now and being adopted in places like Albuquerque. Oklahoma City is making great strides, from Berkeley, California, all the way to Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. Mayors are starting to reimagine what a public safety department can look like. Instead of just an antiquated police department of old, can we actually throw new solutions at these problems? And it's working.
I want to ask you about that because as soon as you said they're doing these experiments where they have unarmed police officers, I instantly thought like, oh dear God, Fox is gonna lose it. But then I remembered, well, in many countries, that's just the way that it is. I mean, in London, the police aren't running around with AR-15s. So you said that they're doing these experiments in these different communities. I'm curious, are they looking to how public safety is managed in other countries, how other places are getting this done, some of the big distinctions between the US and these other countries?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important to first acknowledge and admit to ourselves that what's unique about America is how many guns there are here. We now have more guns than Americans. It's not the case in any other country in the world. So of course that ratchets up the level of danger. But we can still learn from looking at those European countries in particular, and we can learn most by looking at our own operations. So in the city of Ithaca, what we did was look at the last 6 years of data. And we looked at every single call that a police officer was dispatched to. Ask ourselves how long that call took, what was the outcome of that call. And we found out that not only in the vast majority of calls these officers are being dispatched to, not only are the vast majority not resulting in arrests, that there are 7 call types, entire categories of calls that when we come in, we know result in arrests 0% of the time, 0%, right? So those 7 categories make up about 40% of an officer's time. So we already know before we dispatch that they'll never need to use force, that a car is parking or blocking a driveway and it needs to be ticketed. Somebody called for a cat stuck in a tree. Somebody's fallen down the stairs, they're injured, they need to be stabilized until the EMS can arrive. With these calls, we know that an officer showing up with a weapon is not needed. What we also know is that when you send an officer with a weapon, it actually creates a chance of escalation into violent conflict. Right? So getting the officers out of harm's way is the first step to getting the citizens out of harm's way. And then if we can create these alternative responses, then your armed officers, which still exists, right? You still have armed officers, but they have more time and space to, one, focus on their own health, right? So that they are healthier and less likely to be violent when they show up to a scene. But also so they can focus on serious crimes, right? Mm-hmm. Stopping guns from killing more people in our streets. They can focus on serious narcotics. They can actually solve crimes instead of what antique police departments do, which is respond to them after the fact.
So mainly there you seem to be distinguishing between which of the cops should go to these things, whether they need to be armed, which I definitely agree, having less guns around just naturally stops some of this crime from happening. I know in a lot of the initial conversations about police reform that might be encapsulated under the umbrella of this concept of defund the police, the idea would be that in theory, there might be other trained professionals, experts, who are better served than the police can be to do certain types of jobs. So in these experiments, I know you're talking about unarmed cops versus armed cops. Are they also working with other sorts of either mental health professionals or medical professionals?
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes you're dispatching a trained mental health counselor by themselves. Sometimes you dispatch them arm in arm with an officer. The longest running such experiment in the US is not 2 years old, but it's about 30 years old, and it's in Eugene, Oregon. The lessons they learned there were that not only were there fewer lawsuits against the police department, not only were fewer people injured by police officers, not only were fewer people killed by police officers, but more people were able to get the mental health treatment they needed, because instead of resisting this face of authority that showed up, they worked with them. So in Ithaca, we've been doing a similar program for about the last 7 years with similarly great results. It ends up saving you money, lowering your taxpayer costs, because instead of detaining people, which is very expensive, and sending folks to city court, which is expensive, and then the officer's time, which is on average far more expensive than the mental health professional's time, something we should talk about, by the way. We don't need to defund the police so much as we need to fund mental health professionals at a higher level. What you end up seeing in these experiments is that it is safer all around and leads to a lower cost for taxpayers, which is a win-win.
Definitely, and it's a part of the whole funding thing that might not get focused on. That in fact you could have cost savings that could then go to other things, which in theory everyone should support. We mentioned when I introduced you that you are the executive director of People for the American Way. Can you tell us about All Safe, Transforming Public Safety?
Yeah, absolutely. So here's the thing. You just mentioned defund. The worst thing about this conversation is how it has been broken down into slogans. To care about this issue, and everybody in America should care about this issue. The killing of George Floyd sparked the largest uprisings in American history. Because of that death, yes, but because that should have sent us a signal that this mattered and that something deeper was afoot. So we have to get past the slogans into actual solutions. We have assembled in the All Safe report the most comprehensive set of solutions for public safety departments. Every city in the country should be looking at this as a manual that they can use to make their police officers safer, to make their streets safer, and to lower their costs for their residents. If you go to People for the American Way's website and check out All Safe, you'll see that we've studied other communities both in and outside of our country. We've talked to elected officials. We spent 2.5 years working with some of the leading criminologists in the world to come up with a report that can lead us to a better place on public safety.
Okay, so everyone watching, definitely do that. Finally, though, I am curious about, especially considering the amount of work that went into this in research, and not only your personal experience and knowledge from serving in Ithaca, but what you've said about all these other areas. These experiments are going on for a long time, and obviously, public safety, law enforcement. These are things that a lot of the attention needs to be it's local and it's state level. There's only so much the federal government can do. But I am curious, in the period we've now had of the first term of Joe Biden, his approach to this topic. Do you feel like he's learning the right lessons, talking to the right people, to the extent that he can influence this? What do you think about what the efforts that the White House has made in this area?
Yeah, they're learning. I think they're learning. I think, look, let me be, look, I try to make it a point to not criticize a Democratic president after Labor Day in a midterm year, right? That's like not wearing white, right? Okay, here's what I think. He's smart. He's done a very, very good job of sending more resources to local governments to solve this problem. I do think you could take a page out of the Obama administration, though, where they used that money as an incentive. That is to say, in order to get the funds, you had to prove that you were raising the standard of your police department. To just send money to any department, whether or not they are meeting the standard, is just to send good money after bad. And you could be funding the salaries of bad apples instead of raising the standard for law enforcement in this country. But I think they're doing pretty good, is the truth. I'm not just saying that. I do think they're figuring it out.
Awesome. No, I think that's a very reasonable standard. I don't know who would be opposed to that. But as we said, anybody watching this that wants more information from this comprehensive report can head over to the website, and I definitely think that you should. Svante, I want to thank you for taking time out and helping educate us. Hopefully we can continue this conversation because this is a massive enterprise. It's ongoing at multiple levels. I'd love to talk to you about it again.
Absolutely. It's the work of generations. So I appreciate you keeping your eye on it. And thank you for having me on.